Good morning, Lions Nation. The Detroit Lions just made one of those quiet offseason moves that immediately gets the fan base talking because nobody really saw it coming. Right as attention is starting to shift toward OTAs and roster battles, Detroit suddenly signs veteran wide receiver Cedric Wilson Jr. And now the big question becomes simple. Is this just another camp body, or is there actually a path for him to make this football team? What makes this interesting is that this is exactly the kind of move the Lions tend to make when they believe competition matters more than reputation. This front office has never been afraid to bring in veterans quietly and let them fight for a role. Sometimes those players disappear quickly, and sometimes they surprise people. Cedric Wilson Jr. now enters that exact situation in Detroit. The first thing that stands out is experience. Wilson is 31 years old, came out of Boise State, and originally entered the NFL as a 6th round pick by the Dallas Cowboys in 2018. Since then, he spent time with Dallas, the Miami Dolphins, and the New Orleans Saints before landing here with the Lions. On paper, this does not look like a massive signing. Last season with Miami, he finished with only 5 receptions for 44 yards. Those numbers are not going to excite anybody. Nobody is looking at that stat line and saying the Lions just found a major offensive weapon. But when you look deeper into it, you can understand why Detroit at least wanted to bring him into the building. The Lions clearly see something worth evaluating. This coaching staff does not waste roster spots during this phase of the offseason. Every single addition has a purpose, especially with training camp battles approaching. One thing that immediately jumps out when looking at Wilson's recent years is availability. He consistently played games, 15 games one season, 15 again, then another 15. Last season he appeared in 10. That matters because Detroit values reliability and professionalism, especially from veterans competing for depth roles. Even if he's not putting up huge yardage totals, the Lions may believe he can still function as a dependable possession receiver in certain situations. And honestly, when you look at the targets compared to receptions throughout parts of his career, there is something there. He has shown the ability to convert opportunities into catches at a respectable rate. That could matter on a roster where not every receiver needs to be a superstar. Detroit already has the heavy hitters. They already know who the main names are in this offense. You've got Amon-Ra St. Brown leading the room. You've got Jameson Williams continuing to grow into a bigger role. The Lions also clearly believe in Isaac Taslaia as part of the future. Then there's Greg Dortch, who already feels like a strong candidate to lock down a roster spot because of his versatility. And don't forget Kendrick Law, a player Detroit reportedly valued enough to trade up for. That's where this conversation gets really fascinating, because if the Lions carry only 5 receivers, Cedric Wilson Jr. probably has a very difficult path. There are simply too many younger players and too much investment already tied into the room, but if Detroit decides to carry 6 wide receivers, suddenly things become much more interesting. At that point, Wilson's veteran experience could absolutely give him an advantage over younger developmental players trying to earn a spot. He may not need to put up huge numbers. He may simply need to prove that he can be trusted in key moments, understand the offense, block when needed, and contribute in a complementary role. And this coaching staff values trust. That's why this signing cannot just be dismissed immediately. Fans are going to look at the recent stats and say this is just a practice squad move, but Detroit has surprised people before with roster decisions. The Lions care about role players probably more than most organizations. Dan Campbell's staff loves players who understand situational football and can execute specific assignments without mistakes. There's also another layer to this. Contract details were not immediately available after the signing, and that matters a lot. If this turns out to be more than just a simple 1-year minimum style deal, then suddenly the odds of Wilson making the final roster increase. The Lions usually tell you what they think about a player by the structure of the contract. If there's guaranteed money involved or additional commitment beyond one season, fans should absolutely pay attention. At the same time, Detroit's receiver competition is going to be brutal. Players like Dominic Lovett and Jackson Meeks are fighting to prove themselves. Tom Kennedy remains a familiar name around the organization, while Malik Cunningham continues trying to carve out a role. Every rep during camp is going to matter. And the timing of this move feels important because the Lions know this season carries enormous expectations. The offense is is mostly stable, but there are still questions entering camp. The offensive line has to establish chemistry early. The Lions cannot afford a slow start. This team has learned over the last few years how much every single game matters in the NFC race. There's also huge curiosity surrounding the defense and how different things may look moving forward. Fans are waiting to see how much impact defensive coordinator changes could have. They're watching the health of key players closely. They're wondering how aggressive Detroit plans to be defensively compared to previous years. But quietly, this Cedric Wilson Jr. signing adds another intriguing layer to one of the most competitive position battles on the roster, because sometimes these small off-season signings disappear within weeks. And sometimes they turn into the type of veteran depth piece that helps a contender survive a long NFL season. So now the question shifts directly to Lions fans. If Detroit keeps 6 wide receivers, do you believe Cedric Wilson Jr. actually has a real chance to make this roster? Or do you see this strictly as a temporary camp addition before the season begins? What makes this situation even more interesting is that the Lions are entering a completely different phase as a franchise now. This is no longer a rebuilding football team just trying to find talent wherever it can. Detroit is now operating like a contender, and that changes how every roster move gets evaluated. When a team believes it can compete deep into January, even the final receiver spots become incredibly important because those players are no longer just backups. They become insurance policies for a long NFL season. That is why Cedric Wilson Jr.'s arrival cannot simply be brushed aside as meaningless. Detroit understands exactly how quickly depth gets tested. Injuries happen every year. Momentum changes every year. The Lions learned firsthand that you cannot survive an NFL season with weak depth at critical positions. So even if Wilson never becomes a major contributor offensively, the coaching staff may still value the stability he brings to the room. And when you really think about it, the timing of this move says a lot. OTAs are approaching fast. Coaches are preparing to evaluate chemistry, communication, route precision, and trust. This is the phase where veterans can sometimes separate themselves from younger players because they already understand how to function within an NFL offense. Young receivers may have more upside, but veterans usually make fewer mistakes. That matters a lot to a coaching staff led by Dan Campbell. This team has built its identity around accountability and reliability. If a player misses assignments, runs the wrong route, or struggles to execute details consistently, it becomes very difficult to stay on the field. That's why a veteran like Wilson could quietly earn respect throughout camp, even without flashy numbers. And there's another important factor here that fans should not ignore. Detroit's offense may evolve slightly this season, not necessarily dramatically, but enough where role players could become more important than people realize. The Lions already know defenses are going to spend the entire offseason studying ways to slow down their biggest weapons. Opposing defenses are preparing for Jahmyr Gibbs. They're preparing for Amon-Ra St. Brown. They're preparing for Jameson Williams stretching the field vertically. So where do complementary receivers come into play? Critical third downs, red zone possessions, late game drives, situational football. Those are the moments where trusted veterans sometimes become surprisingly valuable. A player does not need 1,000 receiving yards to help a contender. Sometimes a reliable catch on 3rd and 6 in November matters more than flashy stats accumulated early in the year. And if the Lions believe Wilson can provide that kind of situational dependability, then suddenly his path to the roster becomes much more realistic than fans initially assumed. Now, does that mean he is guaranteed anything? Absolutely not. The competition in this room is still intense. Younger players are hungry, and Detroit has invested in youth at the position. The Lions clearly want speed, versatility, and developmental upside throughout the roster. That's why this battle could become one of the most overlooked storylines of training camp, because right now everybody is focused on the stars. Fans want updates on the offensive line. They want to know how the defense looks. They want to hear about pass rush improvements, secondary health, and how the team responds to expectations after becoming one of the NFL's biggest stories over the last 2 seasons. But hidden underneath all of that is this fascinating receiver competition where one veteran signing could quietly change the entire depth chart conversation. And honestly, there's another reason this matters. The Lions cannot afford to start slowly again. That point keeps coming up because Detroit knows how dangerous the NFC has become. Every game matters immediately. The margin for error is smaller now because expectations are higher than they've been in years. The Lions are no longer sneaking up on people. Every opponent circles Detroit on the schedule now. That means the preseason suddenly becomes more important than some fans realize. This offensive line needs reps together. The timing throughout the offense needs to sharpen quickly. The coaching staff has to identify who they trust before week 1 arrives. And for fringe roster players like Cedric Wilson Jr., every practice could determine whether they stay in Detroit or end up searching for another opportunity elsewhere. One thing fans should definitely watch closely is whether Wilson develops chemistry with whichever quarterbacks he works with most during camp practices. Coaches pay attention to consistency. If he becomes a reliable target during camp sessions and preseason games, that could absolutely help him secure either a roster spot or at minimum a place on the practice squad. And make no mistake, Detroit values the practice squad differently now than they used to. Contending teams treat those spots seriously because they know injuries can force roster changes at any moment during the season. Even if Wilson does not make the initial 53-man roster, that does not necessarily mean his time with the Lions would end there. But if Detroit carries 6 receivers, the conversation changes entirely. At that point, experience becomes a major factor, and when you compare Wilson's NFL experience to some of the younger names battling for those final spots, it becomes easier to understand why the Lions decided to make this move in the first place. The biggest thing now is waiting to see how he performs once practices truly begin. Can he still create separation consistently? Can he earn trust in contested situations? Can he contribute enough on special teams or in situational packages to justify keeping 6 receivers? Those questions are going to define this entire battle over the next several weeks. And honestly, this is exactly the kind of under-the-radar roster storyline that becomes incredibly important once the regular season arrives. Every year, there's at least one veteran addition fans overlook during the offseason who ends up playing a much bigger role than expected later in the year. The Lions are clearly giving Cedric Wilson Jr. an opportunity to prove he can be that kind of player in Detroit. And the more you think about it, the more this entire conversation comes down to how aggressive the Lions want to be with roster construction this season, because carrying 6 wide receivers is not just about adding one extra pass catcher. It affects other position groups too. Every roster decision in the NFL creates a chain reaction somewhere else, and Detroit's coaching staff knows that better than anybody. If they decide to keep 6 receivers, that could mean 1 fewer player somewhere else on the roster. Maybe 1 less defensive lineman, maybe 1 less linebacker, maybe 1 less developmental offensive lineman. That is why Cedric Wilson Jr.'s battle is bigger than just his own future. His